And so I'm calling this the section on re-identification risk, perception versus reality, because a lot of people think that data is re-identifiable, and sometimes it may not be. And context is extremely important. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of how we start reasoning about these problems. Okay, so let's begin with the face that launched 1,000 ships. How many people are familiar with this slide, besides Mark? This all started back in the 90s, this notion of re-identifiability in microdata, individual level records. So back in the 1990s, hospital discharge information, in particular inpatient data, was collected by each state and was disseminated for research purposes. Now, does everyone remember when Hillary Clinton was trying to reform healthcare back in the 1990s? And I say try. Okay, so what ended up happening was she went to the National Association of Health Data Organizations and she said, what type of data do you need that is going to make it easier for you to do health policy research? And these were some of the things that they said they wanted. They want to know the ethnicity of somebody, they want to know when they were at the hospital, what they were diagnosed with, what procedures were performed, how much it cost, what meds they were on, and some of the demographics about these people, right? At this time, around this time, there was a gentleman, a very famous gentleman, who was giving a talk and he ended up collapsing. And nobody knew what happened to him. It was a completely mysterious disorder. And so LaTanya Sweeney said, well, I bet I might be able to find who this person was. I think that they were in the discharge reports. And so she went off and she got the hospital discharge data for the state of Massachusetts. And then she went off and she found this other piece of information, which were the publicly available voter registration lists in the city of Cambridge, because this person lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so you notice that this is completely identified information, and it had very similar types of features in terms of the demographics. So we've got some zip codes, some birth dates, some genders. And lo and behold, when you crossed these sets of information, she ended up performing a re-identification of this certain individual. And at the time, that was the governor of the state of Massachusetts, which was William Weld. And this became famous. I mean, this became such a major re-identification that various newspapers picked up on this, and they didn't completely understand what happened. Various stories said, computer scientist cracks the code. Other ones said that the computer scientist figured out how to break the encryption. And in reality, it was just this little simple join, right? So this was this kind of was the premise to where this notion of safe harbor had actually come from, because it said, what features did you use for re-identification? So did you use zip code? Sorry, that's going to be out. We're not going to be able to give that out anymore. Birth dates, dates and genders, sorry, no, dates aren't going to go out anymore. And so these types of things, these little attacks were designed to determine what you were allowed to disseminate or not. And I'll talk a little bit about more of this in a second. But more importantly, there was this report that was issued that said, look, those features that were actually used to identify this particular individual, turns out that if you take the combination of 5-digit zip code in terms of where somebody lives, their residence, their birth date, and their gender, that the initial estimate was that about 87% of the United States population was unique. And that was a study that LaTanya had published, and then Philip Gall at Park, the Palo Alto Research Center, back in 2006 said, well, maybe that's a little bit of an overestimate. Maybe it's closer to 63%. But regardless, it's still a lot of people. Now, this is a phenomenon. Now, it's not something that is localized to the healthcare community. So back in 2006, stop me if you've heard this one, AOL ended up disclosing a bunch of search logs for its users, actually about 650,000 users to be exact, 20 million queries over a 3-month period. And what they did was they took the names of these individuals and they replaced them with persistent pseudonyms. So you see here I've got John Doe showing up twice, both those mapped to user 8123. And they gave out these queries, the dates of the query, and the time in which they issued it. Now, this information was put online. Let me give you an example. So here's a particular user. So I have the AOL search logs data, by the way, and you can have them too. So this is one particular user. This is user 2708. Notice that they're searching for things like revenge tactics, let's see, something in the Marblehead, Massachusetts library, alt.revenge, the Encyclopedia of Revenge, Help for Revenge, that's one of my favorite ones. What you're actually looking at here is, so this is the user, this is the query that they issued, this is the time at which they issued it. This little number over here tells you in the query search results, what did they actually click? Okay, so if you look at that little thing right here, so you see where it says 5? So this spysite.com was the 5th one down in the search log. And the reason why they disclosed this was because they wanted people to be able to do research with data that they had internally at AOL. They were trying to be good Samaritans. So here's user 4417749. I know, very sexy name, but they issued hundreds of searches. Okay, here's some of them. So numb fingers, 60 single men. Hey, I think my last name's Arnold. A bunch of other things. Okay, you see where this is going. A lot of really interesting things. Now you notice what just popped up there at the top. So these two guys at the New York Times, they went off, they downloaded the AOL search queries, and they took user 4417749 and they put a face to that name. They used all the information that they had available in that resource and they triangulated on that individual and they found Thelma Arnold. And Dudley. Now, if you go back to this, you see that little blue one in the middle that says the dog that urinates on everything? That's Dudley. Okay? So the timeline of this was, this happened in July 2006. This researcher posted the information. New York Times article came out in early August 2006. By mid-2006, mid-August 2006, the data was taken down. Now, that's what I told you so far. In late August 2006, the AOL CTO resigned. The researcher that posted that information and his project manager were both dismissed. And then in September of 2006, the class action lawsuit came out against AOL. It's not just AOL. So you thought you would have learned from that, right? So Netflix. Nicholas Terry actually mentioned this in his previous talk. He said Netflix gave him inspiration. Well, I don't know how often you use Netflix. So in 2008, Netflix issued this challenge. And they said, we're going to give out a data set of people's movie selections. And we're going to give it out to data miners and machine learners. And if you can improve our recommendations engine by 10%, we'll give you $1 million. Right? And during this time, there were thousands of people that went off and downloaded this data set. So it was about 450,000 pseudonymized subscribers, just like I showed. And what a couple friends of mine actually did was they took the Netflix challenge data set, and then they went to the Internet Movie Database, which people identified themselves and they wrote lots of reviews about the movies that they had watched. And then they found that a lot of the movies that people had watched were in common with what was in the Netflix challenge. And they showed that it didn't take many movies to make you unique. And they used this to claim that they could re-identify individuals. And then in December 2009, again, a class action lawsuit was filed. This is still pending. But I want to make something very clear. What I call samples and the populations from which those are derived, okay? So we could do a dance to this, the sample, 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 samples dance, because you're going to want to remember that term for the rest of this talk. Here's why I say you want to remember this. When you see some of these publications, when you see that re-identifications are claimed to be possible, you have to ask yourself this question. So Netflix is a sample of a larger population. And the identification that was claimed was that the people who were in the Internet Movie Database corresponded to that same population, or that IMDb was a superset of that population. But we don't know if that's the case, right? We don't know if it's the case that IMDb is actually a subset of Netflix, in which case it would still be a problem. But it might be that this is the case. It might be the case that you have unique movies that you have watched, but it could be that there's somebody else who watched the same exact movies as you. And I can't prove that it's the same individual or not. So all those additional those movies that you watched, I might not be able to assign to you. So this is the samples versus population problem. So coming back to what we're talking about here, coming back to the healthcare problem, or now back to your regularly scheduled programming, let's talk about Hipaa for a second. So specifically, I want to talk about Hipaa and the notion of secondary data sharing. So as we all know, there's this notion of protected health information, that's PHI. And this is defined as individually identifiable health information that is either explicitly linked to a particular individual, or it could reasonably be expected to allow individual identification. This is a very, very, very subjective term. okay? And the interpretation of this term is not very well consistent across people's analysis of Hipaa. And I'm not going to debate that today. More about re-identification, how it happens, and then we can come back and talk about what reasonable is. So in secondary data sharing, Hipaa actually gives you 3 different ways in which you can share information basically without patient consent. These are known as the safe harbor standards, the statistical and scientific data standards, and limited data sets. And let me talk about a couple of these in particular. So safe harbor, how many people are familiar with safe harbor besides the people that worked at NCVHS? So safe harbor basically says this is data that can be given away without oversight. All right? It says you got to remove all these enumerated 18 features. That includes the names, addresses, geocodes. Actually, it corresponds to geocodes on a population that is smaller than 20,000 individuals. You have to remove all elements of dates. Remember, this kind of derives from things that we saw back in the 1990s. You're allowed to retain year. You can't disclose somebody's age over the age of 89 or anything that implies that. And then these are the no-brainers. You know, get rid of phone numbers, social security numbers, medical record numbers, biometric identifiers. Then there's this little catch-all that says any other unique identifying number, characteristic, or code. We'll come back to that. The limited data set, on the other hand, the limited data set says, you know, a lot of people in epidemiology and other fields go, I can't do a study without knowing where this person was. And if you can't tell me where geographically they were or when they were actually there, I can't run a surveillance study. I can't determine if the flu pandemic was running rampant in a particular location or if it was just dispersed over an entire state. So limited data set said, look, you can have that type of information. You can get dates back. You can get geocodes back. But you have to sign your life away in blood, right, to a certain extent. And that's what the data use agreement is. It says you will not try to identify any of the individuals that is within this set. Okay? So it's kind of like this complementation, this complementary aspect of we're going to suppress some information, we recognize there's some identifiability, but we're going to trust you. All right? We published a paper 2 days ago, actually, in which what we did was we wanted to know the relationship and the risks in the residual demographics between safe harbor data and limited data set data. And so what we did was we went back to the US Census statistics, which corresponds to aggregate statistics broken down by geocode, ethnicity, gender of individuals, and it gives you an estimate of how many people live in certain places with certain characteristics. This is very similar to the type of data that had been used in the earlier studies of those 63 to 87% statistics, but now we're trying to tailor it to Hipaa. And so what we're going to ask is how unique or how distinguishing are individuals in reality? And I call this beyond uniqueness because there's this inkling of in a set, okay? Some people think that if you can uniquely establish an identity that that's a violation. Other people might say, well, you know, what happens if I put you within a group of 2? Do you feel comfortable with that? And a lot of people go, no. Well, what about a group of 3? Maybe not. Group of 4, group of 5. You know, we could keep going up in this group size or this distinguishability aspect until somebody feels comfortable. Now, the US Census Bureau ends up using numbers like 5 or 10. Hipaa has this magic number of 20,000 with respect to geocodes. Now, that's just geocodes, not anything else, right? So we took this out beyond uniqueness. Now, I'm going to pick on the state of Tennessee for a second, okay? So what you see in this graph is that the red corresponds to the cumulative distribution function, in which, so what this means is that right here, 1,000 people, that means that if I choose the group size of 1,000, how many people in the population are in a group of 1,000 or less, okay? Now, there's not many people that are unique in that group. It's on the order of 0.0003% of the population. But limited data sets, on the other hand, limited data sets, this one in blue, initially has about 33% of the population uniquely represented by their demographics, okay? The demographics that we're doing in this study was race, gender, date of birth, and county for various reasons. Safe harbor, on the other hand, was race, gender, year of birth, and state. And coming back to limited data sets, by around a group size of about 33, almost everybody is identifiable, okay? We did this for all states. So we moved on from Tennessee and we considered this for all states. And left is safe harbor, right is limited data sets. And this is a box and whiskers plot for all 50 states. Notice, for the most part, what this says is that within about 0.01% of the population, you're never above that amount in terms of the people being uniquely identifiable. Whereas in a group size of 10, it comes down to about, this is about 0.3%. So 0.3% of this population, I believe that this is the state of Alaska, is uniquely identifiable. And you contrast that with limited data sets, where basically, similar to what we saw with Tennessee, about 30% on average of a state is uniquely identifiable based on those demographics. And by about a group size of 10, it turns out about 90% of that population is distinguishable, okay? Now, I'm sorry, I'm very sorry. I'm a computer scientist, I like math. It helps, I'm going to keep to a minimum. This is the only slide that's basically going to have math on it. But this comes back to that samples versus populations thing. So these little green groups, these are basically your samples. So imagine this as being, these are the people who are 30 years old and black and living in this particular geocode. And this is our sample, okay? This is the population from which they were derived, okay? The exact same features on that population or on that sample, okay? Now, there are 3 different types of risks that you could define in this context. And they relate to what we saw earlier. One is what you call the prosecutor risk. The prosecutor risk says, I'm going to go to a record in this sample, and who is the worst sample? Who is the worst individual in terms of being identifiable? Who's in the smallest group size? Okay? That's going to be the risk with your data set. Other people say that's the journalist risk. And the journalist risk says, I'm going to go to the general population from which I derived the sample, and I'm going to say that the worst risk, it corresponds to the one with the smallest population size. Now, there's a third one, which is called the marketing risk. The marketing risk says I take the average over all these populations. I tell you the expected number of people I can identify in the entire population, regardless of their group size. Okay? That's all I'm going to talk about with math. Now, they call that the marketing risk. All right? And I say, actually, what we're really talking about is the class action lawsuit risk. I am not a lawyer, by the way. So if I say anything that is wrong from a legal perspective, please correct me. So the cases that we've already seen, this prosecutor risk, this is basically tantamount to the Netflix expose or the discharge case expose. The journalist risk is when you have this AOL expose. And the marketing risk, or the class action lawsuit risk, is when you have the AOL lawsuit or the Netflix lawsuit. All right? Now, just to take a step back and put some of this in context, what we did was we looked at the trust differential, the actual risk change in terms of giving data from somebody in the general population who would get safe harbor data to giving data to somebody in a trusted research environment who has signed their life away in blood to us, right? And basically what we said was, how much more trust do we need to have in that second class? That's what you're looking at here. So if we looked at the number of uniques in that population on the demographics that we studied this on earlier, you basically see that it changes depending on the state that you're in. So in the state of Delaware, you've got about an increase of about a factor of 1,000. In other words, I trust that researcher about 1,000 times more than I trust somebody in the general population. But if I go to the state of Illinois, the population's much larger, I've got less people that are outliers, and so I can re-identify a very small number of people initially with safe harbor, but then in the limited data set setting, I can actually identify a much larger number of people than I would expect to in other settings. Okay, and so in comparison to 1,000, we're now at 65,000. All right? Now, if we go to the Hipaa magic number, the one at which it was 20,000, right, what we see is that this is really weird, but Delaware's risk doesn't change. Okay? So if the concern was identifying individuals within a group of 20,000 or less, it doesn't matter if you give the data out in safe harbor form or limited data set form. Okay? But if you come back to Illinois, it increases by a factor of 37. All right? I'm trying to put this on a numerical scale. Now, what I just showed you was a worst case scenario. And if you recall the statistics of 63% unique or 87% unique with respect to demographics. What exactly does this mean? How am I going to exploit this? All right, so that's the worst case scenario. That's the situation in which somebody has access to identified information to link to that de-identified information. But how are you actually going to do this? So you're going to use these demographics. There's lots and lots and lots of different registries that exist in the world. Birth records exist, death records exist, marriage records exist. There are professional records that exist that reports a lot of information about physicians, the lawyers that are within a particular area. What's in vogue? Voter registration lists. The reason why I talk about voter registration lists is because over the last 10 years, you've seen at least 30 to 50 different publications in the informatics and the computer science community in which they motivate voters by saying, and I'm going to link the data to voter registration databases. And we asked this question of, is that really possible? Can you still do that today? Or was Massachusetts, in this one little town in Massachusetts, Cambridge isn't that small, but was this a unique occurrence? So back in 2008, when we started the study, we actually went to all the electoral commissions in each of the states, which was a lot of fun because this was the middle of campaign season, and they were extremely polite in giving us information that we were interested in. And what we asked was, what fields are you actually sharing? Who has access to the data? Who can use it? And how much does it cost? Because we wanted to know if somebody was going to be prohibited from using it because they didn't have enough money. So again, we're going to do the same study where we take the clinical record, we're going to put it through our two policies, safe harbor, limited data sets, and now we're going to ask what happens if you link it to these voter registration databases. So here's 5 different states. I have an ulterior motive for showing these 5 different states. It's beyond the scope of this, but here's 5 different places. Notice that in the state of Illinois, I've got sex, I've got date of birth, and I've got some other things that I can use, all right? But I don't have race, all right? Whereas in the state of Tennessee, I do get race, I do get date of birth, I do get gender. Minnesota, for instance, I only get year of birth, and I don't get gender, and I don't get race, all right? Wisconsin, I'm not getting gender, and I'm not getting race again. Also, look at this little fact that Illinois is about $500, Minnesota it's $46. I come out to Wisconsin, it's going to cost me $12,500 to get this database, okay? So if you just do a strict linkage on now this reduced amount of information, we find that the identifiability of these populations actually decreases, which you would expect. On average, it turns out it decreases by about a factor of 3 on average. In some states, it drops to as low as 0, all right? As an example, here's Illinois, right? So Illinois didn't give us certain features of information, so I don't believe that we had race in this context. Whereas in Tennessee, it doesn't change at all because we get all the factors that we want to use in our re-identification attack. Now, how much does it cost? How much does it cost to actually re-identify somebody? So we rank ordered each of the states in terms of how risky they actually were with respect to this type of an attack. And there are some states in which it doesn't cost anything to get the voter registration data. So Virginia, New York, South Carolina. Let's start with safe harbor. In this situation, we'd be able to identify 221 people in Virginia, 221 people in New York, and it wouldn't cost us anything to do it, all right? And in the limited data set setting, we're identifying over 1 million, 2 million people, and it's not going to cost us anything to do it. But if you come back to a state like Wisconsin, they don't give out a lot of information to begin with. It costs a lot of money. So in the context of safe harbor, you get 2 people on average, and it would cost you $6,250 to do each of those people, all right? In the limited data set case, it would cost you $174 per person. You get 72 people. West Virginia, I could do 1 person, and it would cost me $17,000, okay? So basically what we're showing is that the risk changes depending on where you are, the cost changes depending on where you are, and a blanket policy may not be the best thing in terms of determining how to protect information. A little bit more about this notion of the difference between the perceived versus actual risks. Here's 2 different data sets. All right? The blue one is sample A, the red one is sample B. The blue ones, each of these have 10 people in them, okay? And the blue one's got one person that exists within a group of 1. And it's got 9 people that exist within a group of 10. And this red one's got, let's see, was it 6 people in a group of 5 and I guess 3 people in, or something, 2.5. I don't know how I get 2.5 people in a group of 6. Anyway, just trust my numbers, all right? The numbers were correct when I initially did this. But what I wanted you to recognize was that the perception of risk changes depending on the problem that you're trying to stop. So the journalist attack is saying, I can identify a single person. And if I can identify that single person, I can bring down your entire operation. Okay? So the most risky data set in that context is this blue one. Okay? So you've got like a perfect re-identification. Right? So you're going to take that down. But whoa, whoa, whoa. If you come into this class action lawsuit environment or this marketer scenario, these two data sets are basically equivalent in terms of their risks. Okay? So you got to figure out what you're actually concerned with. Is it a single person, or is it all the people, or is it a subsection of the people? And when I say a subsection of the people, we went back to here's an example with the state of Kentucky, where blue means that we're interested in group sizes of 5 or less. After that, we consider that you're not risky. The red one says that you're within a group of 10 or less. And so, the risk changes. It increases if we account for those people that are in groups 6 through 10, okay? But it doesn't change that much, all right? The other thing so again, I'm going to get quantitative on you for a second. When we did this class action lawsuit analysis, one of the things we said was that we treated each person as a risk unit, all right? So what that means is that if you're in a group of 1, you contribute 1. If you're in a group of 2, you contribute 1/2. If you're in a group of 3, you can contribute 1/3, okay? But you can also scale this, because we presented this to a couple people in DC, and they go, well, somebody in a group of 2, I don't think you need 2 of those people to equal a group of 1. Maybe what you need is like 5 or 6 of those people. And we said, fine, you can tune this type of a model to whatever you want. All you need to do is add a little bit of a scaling factor to this. So for all the mathematicians in the room, for all the informaticists in the room, you'll notice that all this does is it increases the number of people I need to satisfy that problem. All right, so let me shift the perspective. So I've got a couple minutes left. So let me shift the perspective. Pop quiz. Does anybody know what this is? This is audience participation time. So I know you all went to sleep when the math came on, and now you've all got to come back to me. So it's the letter A. This is the second time I've had that answer in 2 days. This is awesome. It's a variable. Could be a variable. So what if I told you that this was a region of the genome? Okay? So this is the letter A. There's about 3.3 billion people in the world that this could possibly correspond to, right? If I show 2 regions of the genome, okay, there's probably about 1.5 billion people in the world in which this is going to correspond to. If I show you 3 regions of the genome, and they're suitably independent, then it's probably about 750,000 people that this could correspond to. Okay, maybe you see where I'm going with this. So if I show you this, you probably go, yeah, that's probably one person. Okay, that's about 1,000 regions of the genome, 1,000 SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Great. Who is this? You're pointing. It's great. This is Devin.
I think you'd need data to know.
Yeah. So
it might be.
So this is, I'm shifting the perspective towards genomics for a second, because this is a hot topic. Not only is it a hot topic, it's ended up shutting down certain systems within the federal government that were trying to share data. But the problem that we're looking at here is that you really have to model the problem. You got to tell me how you figure out who this is, who you say it is. So the argument that I'm going to make to you, and I kind of alluded to this earlier in the presentation, is that uniqueness or distinguishability within a population is not sufficient for me to claim that I know who you are. Okay? So if I showed you a bag of 1,000 genomes, and then I gave you a bag that had 1,000 names in it, and I said, hey, match the names to the genomes, chances are you're not doing it. right? Chances are the probability of you getting anybody correct is 1 in 1,000, all right? So you've got to have some type of a linking mechanism. If you don't have that linking mechanism, to a certain extent, you can't prove to me that this is a concern. So you have to ask, where does this data live? Where does the genomic data live? Who's going to have it? So it could be a forensic scientist. It could be a life sciences researcher. It could be a paternity company. Maybe, maybe not. We don't know, okay? Some people argue that's anybody who gets a tissue sample on you, right? But if it is somebody who has a tissue sample on you, now they got to go off and sequence the exact same regions of the genome that were published about you. They got to do it in the same way, right? So I call this the "we fear what we don't understand" problem. Let me give an example of why I say we fear what we don't understand. So back in, I guess this was 2008, mid-2008, these were the headlines in various newspapers around the country. This corresponded to a particular place in the federal government known as the Database of Genotype and Phenotype. Okay, the Database of Genotype and Phenotype basically says, we're going to take all this data on genetic information, DNA sequences, and clinical information, demographics, and it's going to be used in all these research studies around the country. You're going to put it in this database, and then we're going to redistribute it to the rest of the country. And so they put some publicly available versions of the data online, and then a couple of researchers said, hey, we can figure out certain things about these people. And so the federal government went, okay, bad idea. Really, really, really bad idea. We never should have put that data up to begin with, and so they pulled it all offline. And as soon as they did, the media caught wind of the blood in the water, so to speak, and started publishing these stories. So Los Angeles Times said the DNA databases were blocked from the public. The Science Now Daily News said that this is good for cops, but bad for the NIH. It would be good for cops because they'd be able to figure out where somebody was. And then this other study said, or this other paper said, that it was a forensic breakthrough that stirs the NIH to close the data from the public view. And then, to a certain extent, this wasn't completely true. It just meant that it wasn't on a public website. As a public person in the public, I could still come to the NIH and still get this data if I wanted it. I just had to ask permission for it. But I say we fear what we don't understand. You have to know what actually happened. So imagine that this is the data that was at dbGaP, and this is an example of what they claimed. And it's not just a claim, they proved it. So imagine I showed you two different clinical classes. These are the people who had diabetes, and these are the people who didn't have diabetes. And then for each of the regions of the genome, I give you the probability of saying this guy had an A 20% of the time, or this population had a T 80% of the time. And I do this for each of the regions of the genome, okay? And you do this for each of the classes. Now, what these guys did, who were forensic scientists, they said, look, if I've got a particular person who I already know who he is, and I have his DNA sequence on the same regions of the genome, then I can do two things. Firstly, I can go into a publicly available resource known as HapMap, and I say, was this person in HapMap, or was he in the study that was published in dbGaP? And it's a probabilistic estimate. And if they can rule out HapMap, if they can say that you're in that study, the next thing that they would do is they say, okay, of that study, were you in the positive class based on the probabilities, or were you in the negative class? And then if they could do that correctly, then what they would learn is whether or not you had a positive occurrence of diabetes or a negative. And this is what's known as an attribute disclosure attack. So they already knew who the person was, but now what they're learning is additional information about him. The weird thing about this is that Hipaa says absolutely nothing about attribute attacks or attribute disclosure problems. The only thing that Hipaa actually talks about is the identity of the individuals. That's a claim. If somebody wants to dispute me on that, we can go to fisticuffs afterwards. Okay, so I say that we need to model the concerns. So, because that was a particular type of attack in which I already knew who the person was. So if I give you DNA, I got to know what additional information you're sharing about this person. Because in reality, the attack vector is probably not going to be the DNA. The attack vector is probably going to be the other information that's easier to exploit, like demographics, which exists in publicly available resources. So if I give you DNA, it might have demographics, it might have some familial information, it might have some clinical features that I disseminate about that person, it might have some specific semantics about the collection environment that is an inference I can use to identify that person. So as an example of clinical features, let me explain why I got into this or why I'm interested about this. So Vanderbilt, about 5 years ago, started building the largest DNA repository tied to electronic medical records in the country. We currently have about 85,000 DNA samples tied to medical records, and that's slowly ramping up to around 500,000. And from the informatics perspective, we're taking everything from clinical notes to clinical messages to orderables to ICD-9s and CPTs and SNOMED codes, and then we're tying all of that together, and then we're doing genome-wide association studies with this data. Okay? Let's skip over this. Now, what happens, though, is that each of these places has to send this data over to the federal government. They have to send it into the database, the db-GAP. All right? And the concern that a lot of these places voice is that, well, I don't want my data to be re-identifiable. Okay? I really don't feel comfortable sharing it unless you can tell me that it's not going to be re-identifiable. Now, this is a network that Vanderbilt actually participates in. This is why I did that study of the demographics in these 5 states that I showed you earlier. So Group Health of Puget Sound is in Washington. Marshfield Clinic is in Wisconsin, Vanderbilt's in Tennessee, Mayo Clinic is in Minnesota, and Northwestern is in Illinois. These are 5 different centers that are funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute that are doing studies between DNA and data derived from electronic medical record systems. And the funding condition was that we all have to contribute de-identified genomic and EMR-derived phenotype data to the database of genotype and phenotype. Where did this come from? Well, in 2003, the NIH published their data sharing policy. Okay? How many people are familiar with the data sharing policy? Some of you? Yeah. So it said that the data should be made as freely and widely available as possible. This was the philosophy of the NIH. And they said that if it's applicable to anybody who receives at least $500,000 in any particular year of a study that they run. And that the data, and it wasn't very clear about this, but it just said that the data must be derived in such a manner that it is devoid of identifiable information. And it kind of pointed back to the Hipaa safe harbor policy. And then in 2006, it published the GWAS policy. And the GWAS policy said, I don't care how much data we give you, how much money we give you. You're giving us the data. Doesn't matter. And so the concern at this point was, so is DNA an identifier? Because how do we give you de-identified certifications if DNA is going to be an identifier? And this is a debate that's still raging with db-GAP. The problem, though, was that when you start deriving information from electronic medical record systems, things get standardized really quickly, and that standardized information starts showing up in multiple places. Okay? So one of the things that we did was we took a look at the diagnosis codes that corresponded to the study that we were doing. So we had about 2,500 patients in which we were doing a study on long QT syndrome. And of these patients, we said, here's their profile, their clinical profile and standardized ICD-9s. How unique are these people in the population? Because that data is going to show up in discharge records. It's going to be shown in the identified electronic medical record system itself. And now it's tied to DNA. So who's going to be able to use this data, and is it unique? And when we compared this 2,500 group, population of 2,500, to the entire Vanderbilt population, which constitutes about 1.5 million medical records, we found that about 97% of them were unique on their diagnosis codes. And so we started asking this question of, well, is this another quasi-identifier? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on what access the people who are going to, what access to data people may have. So that's an example of how clinical features can actually lead to re-identification of genomic data. In reality, we're not exploiting the genomic data. Familial information is another environment in which we've done some re-identification studies. This corresponds to the fact that a lot of places are starting to publish pedigree information or family structures. And we started looking at, well, where could we learn family structures from publicly available data? And we found that obituary information is relatively publicly available. And you can find it in your nearest newspaper. And these things are pretty detailed. So as an example, this is a guy who died in Cheyenne, Wyoming. this back in 2007. Now notice that what I'm showing you here is that it says that he was survived by 2 sons, 7 daughters, and he's got 25 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren. But you got to be a little bit intelligent about this. So there's some more information, which is that he was preceded in death by an additional 2 daughters, and 2 brothers. And these things become pretty distinguishing pretty quick. So we took a look at 2-generation pedigrees, just parents, children, and their siblings. And what we found was that most of the population, at least in the states that we did the study on, I think we found about 65% to 70% of those pedigrees were uniquely identifiable. And this is not, and we actually verified that it had population coverage using the Social Security Death Index databases. So we not only could show you that they were unique, but we could give a proof that it was the actual correct individuals that we were trying to re-identify. So I'm going to run out of time. I'm definitely going to run out of time. What I haven't told you is that there are protection models. There are formal protection models. But I wasn't asked to talk about protection models. I was asked to talk about the risks of re-identification. So we can talk about that at a later date. What I will do is I will jump down to the end, and I will say that this is the current landscape as I see it. So there exists a potential for compromise of individuals' identities when this data gets shared. However, there also exist means to prevent this. What I presented to you were formal models of re-identification. You can imagine how you could change the data or suppress information such that you could guarantee I could not achieve these types of things anymore. So the recommendations that I am giving are very broad and very simple in their recommendations, is that I would say that you need to model the threat in terms of you need to know who you're giving the data to, you need to know how much it's going to cost for them to do something with it, not just monetarily, but in terms of how much computer power it's going to require for them to actually execute such an attack. And you have to understand when you're actually sharing the data. Secondly, you have to understand the replicability of features. So if I show you a piece of DNA and it's like a little microarray, that may not be replicable, okay? And so the fact that it's unique may not be sufficient to constitute that there's a violation. And that you need to be very formal in the risk mitigation that you perform. So you can't just ad hocly de-identify the information and say, we've removed the identity. It doesn't work. We know that it doesn't work. We have lots and lots and lots of cases in which it doesn't work. And so it's a matter of actually pushing things into a more formal space. So that's where I say, questions, comments. If you want to throw tomatoes at me, I can put them at the back. But I'll stop there.
We can go ahead and do maybe 1 or 2 questions, and we can reserve the remainder for afterwards.
So you mentioned this early on, and I think from the Hipaa perspective, I would characterize you as being an unreasonable person. But the term of reasonable is not adequately explicit in terms of that. And so from your perspective, what is the population of people who would use unreasonable methodologies, such as you're describing, to do re-identification?
So I don't think the mic's on, but I'll speak louder. Is it?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, I see a little red dot.
Little red dot.
Yeah.
Sorry. So now I speak louder and you get mad at me. So 2 things. The notion of unreasonable, that is equal to what was voiced in the state of Illinois back in 2006 when they actually ruled on some of the re-identification study actually done. And they said that the methods that she had used were not reasonable, and that that didn't constitute a violation underneath certain principles. Now, in terms of who would actually do something like this, that's a great question. And I'm not going to completely speculate, but it depends on the risk model that you would have in mind. So I have absolutely no doubt that if the data was made public, you're going to have journalists run to it. That's going to be one of the first groups that I suspect to do it. And I don't think that they would be unethical in their efforts. I think that they would be trying to exploit a potential hole and show what could possibly happen. Now, whether or not an individual would actually do it, who would take the data and apply it for malicious purposes, that's a great question, and I don't know. That's the best answer I can give you. It's not a good answer, is it?
Brad, at a subjective level, how would you rate the risk of this general kind of attack against the risk of a hacker exploiting a vulnerability in Windows on the system that's running your doctor's EHR, your hospital's EHR, and getting all your information?
I don't know. The easiest answer I can give to that is that it's different premises in terms of what's being exploited. So the system in which I try to exploit a security vulnerability, that's an explicit violation of a policy, an explicit violation of expected technical controls. Whereas if the data is posted in a public domain, then it's basically free game. And so I think it's a little different context. Is that fair?
Yeah. What if somebody in the Ukraine who does that
Yeah.
Sells it to journalists or whoever?
I would think they would more likely contact you and try to exploit you or extort you, which has happened. Yeah.